I want to welcome everyone on behalf of New Canaan Library to tonight's program, which is called March of the Fossil Penguins, Examining the Evolution of Penguins Through Time. My name is Kayla Del Biondo. I'm coordinator of outreach and adult programming at New Canaan Library. And this is sort of the second program this month where we've partnered with the Bruce Museum to bring you programs that their subject experts and education specialists are running. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Ksepka tonight. Is that how you say it, Daniel?
Perfect.
Perfect. Daniel earned his PhD through Columbia University, American Museum of Natural History Paleontology program back in 2007. His research focuses on topics such as the fossil record of penguins, the evolution of the avian brain, and flight in giant and extinct birds. His work on dinosaurs, penguins, and extinct birds has attracted much media coverage, including articles in the New York Times, National Geographic, Discovery, as well as interviews with BBC News, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR. At the Bruce Museum, Daniel is currently overseeing the renovation of the Cycles, which is a permanent natural history gallery, which will open in October of 2021, and the new Robert R. Wiener Mineral Gallery, which will open in the fall of 2022. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and take it away, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Kayla. Thank you all for attending. It's always a little bit odd when you can't see your audience, but thank you for listening in, and I'm happy to give a little bit of a background on the ancient history of penguins. And at the end of the talk, I'll show a little preview of what's going on in our new Cycles gallery. So nice to be with you all today, even if it's not in the same room. And I am going to share my screen now because I have some nice pictures of fossil penguins. So this is a reconstruction of an extinct species of penguin that I studied, and we'll get to this one in a moment. But I thought I'd start to talk with why I got into fossil penguins. I think a lot of people, when you ask them, even are there fossil penguins, they might not know if there are any or not. And so it's a rather obscure topic, but as it happens, there are actually thousands of fossilized penguins known throughout the world. And that's because they're marine birds that have very dense bone. And so they live in places where things like sands and silts can become rock, and their bones preserve really well compared to other birds. So they have a remarkable evolutionary history. And the other reason I got into penguins is because everybody loves penguins. And I like to say this during my talks because there's a lot of animal groups that are controversial. If you study spiders or venomous snakes, that will be fascinating to many people. But to others, it may be frightening or upsetting. But I think there's pretty much no one on Earth who is scared of penguins or doesn't like penguins. This is a picture of the newest example of people loving penguins. This is my daughter, Phoebe. She's actually 1 now. This picture was taken a couple months before. But here she is sleeping with her very favorite stuffed animal, which just happens to be stuffed penguin. And I didn't even force it on her. She chose it herself. So I'll begin the field of research by talking about the first ever discovery in historical terms. And this happened almost a century and a half ago when this gentleman, Thomas Henry Huxley, described the first known fossil penguin bone. Huxley may be familiar to some of you. He is probably most well known for being an advocate of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And for that, he was actually known as Darwin's bulldog. He was a very kind of aggressive defender of the theory in its infancy. And he described this bone back in 1859. And it's not very exciting looking. It kind of looks maybe like a Lego. And it's actually missing a piece. But this is a bone that's instantly recognizable as belonging to a penguin. It's what we call the tarsometatarsus. It's basically the ankle bone of a bird. And penguins are different than all other birds in that they have very stubby legs. And so this bone is, about a quarter or even a tenth of the length you might expect in a normal flying bird. So Huxley instantly knew it belonged to a penguin. And he wrote a paper indicating that penguins are much older than people thought before, because this bone's actually about 24 million years in age. Now, penguins actually originated in New Zealand. That bone was from New Zealand. That's the oldest historical record, but the oldest geological record is also from New Zealand. So the first penguins evolved in New Zealand and later were able to kind of spread throughout the world from there. So this is a map of what the Earth would have looked like when the first penguins evolved. This is about 60 million years ago. And you might notice a couple major differences. One is that there's no polar ice. This is a much warmer time. So there's no ice at the North Pole. There's no ice sheets extending off Antarctica. and therefore sea level was much higher. All that water that's locked up in sea ice today would have been free to be in the oceans. And so, Florida's missing. The Mediterranean is basically connecting the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. And India hasn't finished colliding with Asia yet. And also you'll see that you could basically kind of row a boat from Australia or South America to Antarctica, because those continents were in a more southern position as well. So a very different world than we're used to today. And this is the world in which the first penguin evolved. This is an animal called Waimanu manaringai. This is a Maori word that basically means water bird. And this is a skeleton of that animal and a artist reconstruction of what it may have looked like. And if we saw a Waimanu penguin walking around, we might instantly say, I think that's a penguin, but I'm not sure. So there's many similarities. It was flightless. The wings were much shorter than modern birds. It had stubby legs, but at the same time, there were a lot of differences. It had a much longer neck and longer beak than a modern penguin, and the wings were actually capable of folding a little bit, which modern penguins can't do at all. And it probably had a different posture, not as completely bipedal as modern penguins either. And so it's kind of this proto-penguin, this link between flying birds and modern penguins that tells us a lot about how these birds evolved. And it's really, really old. So I like to put that in context. The mass extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs is actually closer to the age of Waimanu than we are. So this is the age of the fossil, about 61 or 62 million years. That asteroid impact that killed off the dinosaurs actually happened about 66 million years ago, whereas the oldest fossils of our own human lineage are only about 7 or 8 million years. And so it's perfectly correct to say that penguins are about 10 times as old as people are, and that they appeared closer to the age of dinosaurs than they did to the age of humans. So they've really been around for a while, and they've done some really cool things over that long history. So New Zealand is the place where I really love doing field work. I've been there 4 times to study and collect fossil penguins with a lot of really great colleagues like Dr. Ewan Fordyce and Dr. Daniel Thomas at Otago University and Massey University. And this is where you might find the penguin in New Zealand. And what's interesting is we tend to think of paleontologists as digging a big hole and pulling fossils out of the ground, but in many of these fossil localities, you're actually kind of pulling them out of a cliff. So here I'm walking along a riverbed, and that's my finger pointing to this red object that's eroding out of that green sandstone. And that's actually a penguin flipper bone that's exposed in cross-section. The reason it's become red is that it's become oxidized, and so some iron that's in the fossilized bone is kind of almost rusting out and creating that red color, and that makes it pretty easy to spot. So this is not a very Indiana Jones-like picture, but here's me and my friend, Paul Brinkman. He's a historian who actually went along on the trip, and we are removing this fossil from the cliff. We're using something called a zip, and it's kind of like a tiny little air hammer. It's basically a pneumatic tool, and so we've used a chainsaw to cut through that rock. As you might guess, if you're able to cut through rock with chainsaw, it's rather soft. And then we're using the zip gun to further expose the penguin bones. And we're going to take that back to the lab to study. So a very different way of doing field work than many other fossil sites in different parts of the world. And here's what we were collecting. We were collecting bones of a giant penguin called Kairuku. And this is a different skeleton that was collected by my colleague, Ewan Fordyce. He's shown there in the photo for scale. And you can see this is a massive penguin. It's one of the largest species ever discovered. And there's a little reconstruction on the left. That's a yellow-eyed penguin, a species that lives in New Zealand today, right next to the fossil locality, in fact. And the reconstruction of Kairuku to show how much bigger it was. So this was quite a huge animal. Here again are the flipper bones of that animal compared again to a yellow-eyed penguin, which is a pretty normal-sized species. And so people often ask me, were these giant penguins bigger than people? And actually, that's a tricky question because the answer might be yes or no, depending on the person you choose. So I usually choose Danny DeVito. And so this is actually a funny illustration that appeared on the internet after one of our papers was published, and I actually don't know who even created it. But this is pretty accurate in terms of the size, if not the shape of the penguin. Kairuku would have stood about 5'3", and so it would have been taller than my kids and about the same height as my wife, a little bit shorter than me. I'm not actually that tall myself, but I would have been about 2 inches taller than Kairuku or so. So this was a beautiful penguin. We have almost the whole skeleton, so we really have a good idea of what it looked like. And it would have been a rather elegant creature, very thick, powerful legs, but a very long and slender trunk. And so much more kind of graceful than a modern penguin in terms of, its shape, and a really long beak too. And so it creates this kind of dashing profile. These are two Kairuku penguins shown next to an extinct dolphin on a beach. And this is what New Zealand may have looked like about 20 or 30 million years ago. There's a little map on the left that shows New Zealand today and New Zealand in the past below. And you can see a lot of it was actually underwater at the time because of that high level of that higher sea level. And so it would have been a very good place for penguins. We actually have 10 different species of penguin living alongside Kairuku, probably because this is a very isolated part of the world. It's hundreds of miles from the nearest other major land masses, and that's good for penguins. When they come ashore, they basically want to be left alone. They are happy in the water, but they do need to come onto the land to lay their eggs. They can't give birth to live chicks like mammals can, and so they do need to return at least part of the time to lay those eggs and start the next generation. And when they do so, they don't want any things like dogs or weasels or cats that might eat their eggs. And so an isolated island is the perfect place to do that. A really cool thing about Kairuku is actually in 2014, New Zealand made it legal tender. So there's a $5 silver coin that actually features Kairuku right on it. And this is actually something you can use as currency in New Zealand. It's actually costs more than $5 to purchase because it's solid silver, but it's worth $5 if you actually accidentally use it to buy a cup of coffee or something like that. So I thought this was one of the coolest fossil penguin souvenirs in existence, and I always keep my copy on my desk. So I'm going to move to another place where there's a lot of really important fossil penguins and a lot of great work going on. This is Peru. I haven't been to Peru in about a decade or so, but back when I was based in North Carolina, I actually visited 5 times to do research on these remarkable specimens that people have collected in the Atacama Desert, and even got a chance to go out there 3 times myself and help look for fossils, not only of penguins, but things like whales and sea turtles and starfish and sharks and all these great creatures that we're finding in the ocean. Peru is an amazing place. This is one of the driest deserts on Earth. This is the Atacama Desert, and it only gets a couple millimeters of rainfall every year. So it's incredibly dry, but it's right next to the ocean, right over the horizon. You'd actually be at the Pacific Ocean, and you could see modern penguins hanging out on the rocks. And so this juxtaposition of a completely dry desert in the world's largest ocean is amazing. And what's happening here is the geological forces that are lifting up the Andes Mountains are actually bringing ancient seafloor up to the surface again. So this photo shows that desert floor, and those bones in the center of the picture, those are the vertebrae of a whale. So this is a fossil whale that died and sank to the bottom of the seafloor, and that seafloor has quite literally been lifted back onto the land again. So it can really be kind of eerie when you're in these environments. You're walking around, under the moonlight or under the scorching sun, and you're seeing teeth from sharks, you're seeing sea urchin spines, you're seeing fish bones. Only they're 30 or so million years in age. So one of the coolest penguins found in Peru is the aptly named Perudiptes. And this is a penguin that tells us a lot about how penguins got their start in a much hotter world. We tend to think of them as polar animals, and indeed some of them live in Antarctica, like the emperor penguin, for example. But a lot of penguin species actually just do perfectly fine with no ice anywhere in sight. And Perudiptes is no exception. This animal lived about 42 million years ago. And if you look at data that tells us how hot the Earth was, it was probably about 5 degrees Celsius warmer on average back then than it is today. So a very hot time in Earth history. And the fossils from Peru, which is about 14 degrees south latitude, so also a very hot place in the world, and it was even hotter back then. And this is, one of the older penguins known. And so we now know that they evolved at a time when there was no polar ice and only adapted to those cold environments later. So a penguin like the Humboldt penguin shown here, which is found in Peru today, is closer, I think, to the ancestral ecology of penguins than something like the emperor penguin. One of the coolest penguins ever lived also in the same areas as Echidiptes, and this is an animal that really blew my mind when I first saw it. This is the skull of a Humboldt penguin. It's just pretty typical of the shape of the penguin face. And here's the skull of Echidiptes. And you can see this animal had just tremendously elongated beak. It was many times longer than a modern penguin, and it was very strongly reinforced with cylindrical bone. And so this was an animal that probably was using its long bill to impale prey like fish or squid. And so it was almost like a spearfishing bird, and something that would have been quite intimidating. You know, it's fun to feed the penguins at the aquarium if you ever get the opportunity to do so, but you definitely wouldn't want to be anywhere near this thing when it was hungry. Mike. I got my 4-year-old here helping me out. Mike, do you want to say hello real quick?
Hello.
Here he is, and now he's going to go to bed. So here is another really remarkable penguin Peru. This is one called Inkayaku, and that means water king. And this is a beautiful skeleton. You can see all of these bones that were found, and that would make this one of the more important fossil penguins ever discovered, just because it's so complete in terms of knowing about the skeleton. But there's something even better about it. It actually preserves some of the soft parts of the animal. So this animal was discovered by a veterinarian student named Aliata Moreno. He's just an incredible fossil hunter. So he was out looking for specimens, and he saw this foot eroding out of the ground. And what you're seeing there is the bottom of a fossil penguin's foot, and there's actually scales still preserved. So you could see the fossil at left with a blow up at the top, showing those scales, and then there's a modern penguin foot below to show how similar they are. And so he nicknamed this fossil Scaly Pedro, and apparently there's a sitcom in South America with this kind of ladies' man character known as Scaly Pedro, and that's why this animal has that funny nickname. And what was even more remarkable than the scales were that there were feathers preserved. So this is a set of 34-million-year-old feathers, the only ancient penguin feathers in existence. On the left, you can see a contour feather. That's the kind of downy feather that keeps the animal warm. And at the center, you see a modern contour feather from an emperor penguin. And you can see the preservation is so fine, you can actually even see the color darkening towards the tip, just like in the modern penguin. And on the right are primary feathers. These are basically flight feathers. In regular birds, you know, these could be a couple inches or even more than a foot long if you're talking about something like a condor. And these are the feathers that form the wing and help the animal fly. In penguins, they're very, very small. That's a 1-millimeter scale bar. So you can see they're reduced and almost scale-like because these animals no longer fly, and they actually want to reduce the length of their feathers so they won't create drag in the water. And so they have a nice stiff, kind of flipper-like wing. What's even more remarkable is there's actually evidence of color in this fossil. And so Jakob Winter, he's a scientist who's now based in the University of Bristol, but studied at Yale. Originally, he discovered this remarkable method of preservation where melanosomes are sometimes fossilized. Now, melanosomes are subcellular organelles. They're very, very small bodies that are preserved in cells, and they basically carry pigment that gives color to structures. And so, you know, we have melanosomes in our hair. Dogs and cats have them in their fur. Birds have them in their feathers, and they create these pigments that can give color to different biological objects. So if we looked at this zebrafinch, for example, different types of melanosomes are responsible for different colors in this feather. So in the black part of the feather, what you see here is eumelanosomes. These carry colors like black and gray, and they look kind of like microscopic hot dogs. In the red part of the feather, or the brown part of the feather, you'll find something called a phaeomelanosome, and it's a much different shape. It looks more like a microscopic M&M. And what's remarkable is these structures are incredibly resistant to destruction. They can survive for tens or even hundreds of millions of years. And so by looking at them and measuring their sizes and shapes, we can estimate the color of something like a fossil feather, even if the real color is long gone. And in the case of Inkayaku, we actually found that the feathers on the underside of the flipper were a reddish brown color, and the feathers from the insulatory parts looked gray. And so this suggests that unlike all modern penguins, which kind of have this black and white tuxedo pattern, this ancient penguin had a much different color. And we think it could be related to different foraging patterns. So animals with dark tops and light bottoms tend to be countershaded, things like the killer whale, for example. So they'll be hard to see from above where you're looking at the black outline against the seafloor, or from below where you're looking at the white outline against the sun, filtering in through the water. Other marine animals like seals and sea lions often have more solid colors. And so we don't really know exactly why these colors were different in this penguin. It could be for display. It could be that they're foraging in more murky waters. That's something that we're really hoping to understand if we can find more fossils from the same site with additional feathers. One of the other things we notice is that the melanosomes of this penguin were much smaller than modern penguin melanosomes. And so on the left are a modern little blue penguin. You can see the melanosomes there. They look like little beans. And on the right are the fossil melanosomes from the Inkayaku feathers. It turns out that the fossil feather melanosomes are pretty normal sizes, whereas those from the modern penguins are huge. So for some reason, penguins have evolved gigantic melanosomes. And that's another thing that people are studying right now. So next, I'd like to stop in Antarctica, and of course, this is a really important part of the world for penguins today. And we want to look a little bit about how we can learn about penguin brain evolution or penguin growth patterns by looking at some of these fossils. So penguins have very different bones than modern birds. If we look at a pelican, for example, we could take a cross section of the femur. So this is basically if we cut a ring out of the major leg bone, the thigh bone in humans is basically the femur, it's almost hollow. And that's because flying birds want to keep their weight as light as possible so they're able to take off easily. If we look at a penguin on the right, we see a much different structure. The bone is almost solid. There's a very small marrow cavity in the middle, but it's a very, very thick bone wall. And this is because penguins actually want to reduce their buoyancy to make it easier for them to dive. It's almost like a built-in diver's weight vest. When we look even closer, we can see the homes formerly occupied by bone cells. So this is what we would call a Haversian canal. This is an opening where a blood vessel would have gone through the bone because bone is living tissue and it needs to be supplied with oxygen and other nutrients. And those little black potato-like things are the lacuna, little chambers, basically apartments for osteocytes, which are bone cells. These are the cells that help build and maintain the bone. And so we can see the structures where the bone cells lived, where they were supplied with nutrients. And the way these structures are laid down tells us a little bit about how quickly an animal grew or its life history. So for example, if you are ever unfortunate enough to break your wrist or to break your elbow, your body will need to repair that. And so once the bone is set back together, the body starts laying down new bone to tie the two broken ends back together. And it starts looking like something on the left. This is woven bone. It's almost like swirly paint. It's being laid down as quickly as possible. So they're not worrying, the bone cells are not worrying about, doing a complete job. They're just getting everything ready as fast as they can. And it ends up looking almost like you squirted a toothpaste of bone out. On the right, we see more laminar bone. And so when you have more time to grow or you grow more slowly, you put it down in a more organized pattern, which looks kind of like little bricks and mortars being laid down. And this is slower growing, but much stronger. And there's where we might see fibrous bone or woven bone being formed in a break. So bone microstructure can reveal something like a healed injury. It can also reveal reproductive patterns. So here's a chicken laying eggs. Here's a penguin bone. And if we look at the cross-section of the bone, we might see something like this. So this is actually from a different specimen. But if you are a bird and you need to create eggs, you need calcium to make the eggshells. And something interesting that birds do is they actually take calcium out of their own skeleton for that purpose. And so the little bottom part of this slice of bone right here, I'll blow that up a little bit. This is something we call medullary bone. So basically the bird is taking calcium out of its skeleton. It's leaving it in the middle of its marrow cavity in this kind of like haphazard pattern. And then when it needs it, it actually takes that into the bloodstream and brings it to where the eggs are being created in the ovaries and uses it to create the egg shell. And so if we find this type of bone in a fossil, we know that A, the animal was a female, and B, that it was about to or recently had laid eggs. And finally, we can look for evidence of growth through something called lags, or lines of arrested growth. These are basically tree rings in bones. So this is an example, not from a penguin, but from a salamander. And basically, what's happening is each year the animal will grow a little bit, and then at the end of its first year, it will pause. So this is probably the time when it's kind of burying itself in mud for the winter. Wakes up in the spring, it grows again for a couple months, hibernates again, and so on and so forth. So in this example, we could say that this salamander was at least 5 years old when it perished. And by measuring the distance between those lines, we can see how much it grew each year. So this is a very useful tool for understanding the growth patterns of animals that are now extinct. Now, the problem from the penguin perspective is that most birds actually don't form lag lines. If you've had baby robins in your yard, for example, they'll hatch, and by the end of the summer, they will be fully adult and they'll be long gone in the fall. They don't kind of hang around, and ride their little tricycles, and then next year they're in school, and next year they're in college. No, they just basically go completely from hatchling to adult in the span of a few months. And so since they never make it to a winter, they don't have time to lay down any of these lag lines. Their skeletons are just done growing by the time they're 1 year old. But as it turns out, some penguins actually do create these lag lines in their bones. And one example is the king penguin. This animal has a remarkable lifestyle where the parents take turns caring for the young. They hatch and they look kind of like this, very, very tiny. But over time, the parents feed them till they grow to be huge. They look kind of like big bags of leaves that you're setting out at the curb to be taken away. And they can actually weigh more than their parents at their peak kind of chubbiness. And then at this point, the parents get tired of them. They leave them alone for 6 weeks while the parents go to feed and replenish their own energy. And when the parents come back, they feed them one more time. They molt into adult feathers and they're ready to go and be off on their own. And during that 6 week period when they're not being fed, they stop growing completely and they live off their fat stores, and they lay down a starvation lag. And so this is a lag where they're not eating at all and it gets preserved in the bone. So my colleagues and I were very interested in this as it pertains to giant penguins like Kairuku. We wanted to know, could we find out if any of these fossil penguins also raise their chicks in this way? And unfortunately, we didn't actually find any evidence of that. I guess you could say it's unfortunate or it's interesting, but we looked at these fossil bones from Antarctica and we sliced them up inside of and there's no evidence at all of a pole. That color difference you're seeing is actually from minerals being leached out of the bone by water, but there's no evidence in the cellular part that the bones are pausing growth. Looking at the shape of the bone, we see something called a reticular pattern. That's one of the fastest types of bone to form, and so we estimated that these birds grew at among the fastest rates in any modern bird group. So the conclusion was that these giant penguins probably grew to full size without pausing at all, and they did so very quickly. So they must have been benefiting from a lot of food sources, probably doing very well in some of these environments like the semi-temperate environments in Antarctica back 30-40 million years ago. So for my last stop, I'd like to kind of come full circle and go back to New Zealand and talk about the youngest fossil penguin. So the oldest is 60 million years old, and the youngest is only 700 years old. This penguin comes from Chatham Islands, which is a group of islands off the coast of New Zealand. It's about 500 kilometers to the east of mainland New Zealand, so it's really very isolated place out in the Pacific Ocean. And this is what it looks like today. So it's quite an imposing area. A lot of it is actually pasture land now, but originally more of it would have been forested. And for many years, it was inhabited only by basically birds and whatever marine life was in the coastal areas around it. But humans actually arrived there about 700 years ago. The Maori people arrived. This is a kind of group of Polynesian settlers who are related to the Maori, New Zealand mainland. And one of the interesting aspects of their culture is creating these dendroglyphs, which are kind of carvings in trees. And around the same time they arrived, a group of birds seemed to be disappearing. And so there seems to be pretty clear evidence that when humans settled the area, they hunted at least a couple different species to extinction, because the youngest fossils of all of those are about the same age as the oldest human evidence of habitation. And also some of the bones are even found in middens, kind of kitchen scrap heaps. And so pretty direct evidence they were being eaten. And so this skull was found there. This was found in sand dunes back about 20 years ago or so by my colleague, Alan Tennyson. And at the time, we weren't sure what it belonged to. But it turns out these bones are young enough, we can still actually get DNA from them. And so from these fossils, Tess Cole, a researcher at Otago University, New Zealand, she was able to actually get mitochondrial DNA. That's the part of our DNA that we get from our mothers, and is present in the mitochondria, basically the little kind of power plants of our cells, and extract that from this ancient bone. And what we found is that this is a completely distinct species of penguin that we named Eudiptes warhemi, that seems to have been wiped out by people just a few centuries ago. This is a nice artist reconstruction of it by Sean Murtha. He's one of our exhibition artists at the Bruce Museum, and he does a lot of bird art. Actually won the Connecticut Audubon Prize one year, and so it's always fun to work with him. And he painted this reconstruction of what this fossil penguin would have looked like. It's standing out there on the rocks. It's next to another penguin in the lower right is a dwarf yellow-eyed penguin. So this is not a separate species, but a population of yellow-eyed penguins that was also living on the island, but had gotten much smaller than the mainland ones. And both of these were wiped out by humans. There's one other species, the little penguin, that still survives there today. But obviously fairly tragic that these animals survived probably for about 1.5 million years or so, according to the DNA, and then were wiped out by humans before we ever really got to know them. And as it happens, this penguin is also a coin now. So this actually happened only about 1.5 months ago, but this penguin is now on a $1 coin in New Zealand. So I can now say that 2 of the fossil penguins I've worked on are legal tender. And a very nice little drawing there of those species. At least this may be one way to let people know that we've lost some of these species, and we really need to take better care of the ones that we have remaining with us. So that's about it for the penguins. If you're interested in learning more about fossil penguins, I'd encourage you to visit March of the Fossil Penguins. That's my blog, which I usually update pretty frequently, but because I have a 1-year-old running around and a 4-year-old running around after her, I haven't been doing as many posts as I usually do, but I'm starting to pick that up again. That has a lot of background on all the species we saw today and a lot of other ones that we didn't have time to mention. So please feel free to check that out. And if we had a couple minutes left, I was just going to show a couple behind the scenes slides of what we're doing at the Bruce Museum right now. So Kayla mentioned the Cycles exhibition. This is our new permanent science gallery that will be opening next October. And so it's well underway. And here's a little bit of the progress shot. So this is from last year, a little shoebox model of Eubrontes, our local dinosaur, with a little lakeside diorama. And that dinosaur has come into being. So here he is being made in the workshop in New York. Starts with a steel armature, foam box go over that. You can see the head being added, and then eventually gets painted and it gets feathers. And so here is the almost complete dinosaur getting its nice coat of feathers. And we do know that this particular species and many other theropod dinosaurs did have feathers based on fossils from places like China. These are the dinosaurs that are closely related to birds. And so this is a beautiful 12-foot specimen that will be one of the centerpieces of the new paleontology gallery. Another treat we have in store for you is the renovated Woodland diorama. If any of you have been to the Bruce, you might remember our beautiful diorama. We're completely renovating it, basically from the floor to ceiling, and doing a new background painting, new animals. We're upgrading the trees, and we're putting in an AV system that will let it go from night to day, because we're focusing on cycles, the rock cycle, the tidal cycle, the day and night cycle, and that's one we'll cover here. You'll be able to stand in the diorama room and see the sunrise and hear the birds singing, hear the cicadas chirping as it gets later in the day, and then watch the lights dim and hear things like coyotes and owls as it goes to night. So here's Sean starting the background, and here's where he is right now. This is wonderful artwork. He's sitting in the actual diorama. It's always funny to walk in there because he's behind the glass and he looks kind of like that the Hall of Presidents ride in Disney World, but he's putting in the Long Island Sound, a little stream running out the Long Island Sound here. And here he is again working on a giant carpet beetle. This is for another part of cycles called the Big Backyard Gallery, and insect at 20 times life scale. And so this animal would be, you know, about the size of a large kernel of corn in real life, but here it is about the size of a hamster. And here's another one of those scenes with the animals. These are pill bugs that are about as big as soccer balls, a giant earwig. We have an earthworm that's longer than a garden hose. And these will all be available in that big backyard. So it's really a lot of fun working on this, and we're well on schedule to open in October. So I hope many of you can join us then. And I think it's safe to say by that time, it will be perfectly safe to all get together in person. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would be very happy to answer any questions anyone may have. And I think, Kayla, you can tell them how to do that.
Yes. Thank you for that. So if anyone has any questions, there's that Q&A feature of Zoom, and that's how we're going to collect them tonight. It looks like someone already did ask you a question. The question is, are there any transitional fossils linked to the fossil penguins?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was in the chat box. Okay, there we go. Are there any transitional fossils linked to fossil penguins? Actually, we don't have any flying penguins yet. And so we know that penguins are related to albatrosses and petrels. And so those large flying seabirds are the closest living relatives of penguins according to their DNA. That means the first penguins probably still have the ability to fly. So you can imagine something like a puffin, for example, that can fly through the air but can dive underwater. And we haven't found them yet, and so we're still looking for them. And if you see any, let me know. It's one of the things I'd most like to discover if I had the chance.
Nice. Does anyone else have any questions? You can use that Q&A feature. It looks like we still have 40 people on with us.
Good. Oh, they doubled while I was talking.
Yep.
Anything you want to know about penguins, but we're too worried about asking, now's your chance. We will actually be doing a penguins exhibition at the Bruce too. And so Cycles is opening in October this year, and the Mineral Gallery and the temporary science, the rotating science gallery will open at the end of 2022, and that will include a penguin show to kick us off. So a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Here come some questions. So what is the most harmful pollutants to these creatures?
That's a good question. I think the one that most immediately threatens penguins is probably oil spills. And so luckily we haven't seen any lately, but every couple of years it seems that, you know, some ship runs aground and and it always seems to happen right next to some pristine wildlife area. And so in South Africa and the Kerguelen Islands near there, there's been a lot of damage to penguin colonies where oil has washed up in the areas where they're feeding. And so if they get coated with that, their feathers kind of lose their waterproofing ability and they can't stay warm. And that's very bad for them. Obviously, they can also get very sick because they'll try to clean it by kind of nibbling at the feathers. And if they ingest it, it can be very bad for them. So there's usually a group of good-hearted people ready to go out and kind of clean them. You can clean them with certain, you know, chemicals. That's very bad. I think we're all worried too about the impact of microplastics on the food chain. We see albatrosses, for example, will basically not eat just microplastics, but they'll eat, you know, anything they find out there that's like a shiny blue piece of plastic. You know, it may be just a water bottle cap or, you know, a piece of a toy or anything, and they'll actually feed that to their chicks, and the chicks can die because they can't digest it. So that seems to be a big worry with the relatives of penguins. And I guess this isn't really pollutant, but overfishing is really creating challenges for them in a lot of parts of the world where people are interested in things like anchovies, for example, and penguins want the same food. If you harvest all the anchovies, they really have to go farther and farther away from their nests, and that can cause them to not be able to raise their chicks successfully. So I don't know if I call that pollution, but it's definitely something that's threatening them. Right.
So someone asked if you have a favorite living species of penguin.
Yes, I like the yellow-eyed penguin, the one I showed in New Zealand. It's called the yellow-eyed penguin, and it really does have a bright yellow eye and a little band over it of yellow feathers, so it looks like it's wearing a ninja mask. It's one of the most endangered species. I think there's only 5,000 pairs left, and they live in New Zealand, but they're very, they're kind of shy, and so they want to come ashore in areas where, there's not a lot of people bothering them. So that means they have limited habitat. I've seen them in the wild. I actually saw them walking by some sheep. So they
Oh,
don't want
wow.
human houses, but they don't seem to mind the sheep. There's a lot of sheep in I think there's about 5 million people and 5 million sheep in New Zealand. So they're very, very common. But other penguins, like the little blue penguin, will nest like under docks where people have their boats. Doesn't get bothered at all. But the yellow-eye's much more shy, and it's just a beautiful bird. Yes, that's my
Awesome.
personal favorite.
So someone else asked a question. What is the extent of penguin habitats nowadays?
They are almost all in the southern hemisphere, and they are actually there's one species that gets into the northern hemisphere, and it does it by like 100 yards. So the Galapagos penguin is on the Galapagos Islands, and the equator runs right through them. And so that penguin just barely makes it north of the equator, but otherwise they're all southern. And you'll find them on all the southern continents. So they're in South Africa. You can see them in Cape Town. They are in South America along both coasts. They're in Antarctica, New Zealand, Australia, and many, many smaller island groups. So you'll find them on places like Macquarie Island or King George Island. Excuse me. They tend to not need to be in cold places. And so some penguins live only on sea ice, like the emperor penguin. When it's on land, it's actually on frozen sea ice. So it's kind of never leaves the ocean if you count dry land and sea ice separately. Excuse me, sorry, a little bit of allergies.
No worries.
The thing that penguins really want is not so much cold, but a place where there's something to eat and people will leave them alone, or animals will leave them alone. So, the Galapagos may seem like a really warm place, but the Humboldt currents going out there is bringing up cold water, and that brings up nutrients and shrimp and fish and all of that good stuff. And it's also isolated, so places where predators can't get at them. That's why they don't love to live on barren, rocky, windswept islands, but if they're out there, they know their chicks won't be eaten by a dog or a weasel or something like that. So nice and lonesome places, I think, is the uniting factor.
So I know you just mentioned islands, but we had someone specifically ask about the penguin populations of the Falkland Islands.
Oh, that's funny. So I've been to Argentina, where there's actually quite a few fossil penguins, and if you say the word Falklands, they're in big trouble. Every little town has a little like Maldives Island, the war memorial. But anyway, regardless of what you call them, there are quite a number of species there. I believe king penguins, macaronis. I think you can see gentoos as well, and maybe even. I don't know if you can see chin straps or not, but I think you can. I believe there's at least 4 different species that are out there. And the kings are probably the biggest attraction. They're the second biggest species. Beautiful birds with the orange on their necks. That's the one that had the breeding cycle with the big brown leaf babies. So I've never been to the islands themselves, but I know there are penguins there.
Nice. Looks like we have one last question. Someone asked about cruise ships and entertainment venues. They say that they're heavily marketing these trips to the poles. Why is that? And is that harmful to these creatures? So I guess.
So I'm not an expert.
How do you interpret that?
Yeah, I know that you don't want cruise ships running over whales and things like that. I am not very familiar with cruise ships that go to Antarctica. I know there are some, and so I think basically, if you're visiting penguins, you don't want to interact with them directly. There's no harm to them if you're photographing them from the deck of a ship. I wouldn't get out and put my arm around it and take a selfie and try to get it to eat popcorn or anything like that. So they kind of ignore humans in Antarctica because they don't perceive us as a threat or food or anything. And so I have a few friends who work in Antarctica on penguins, and they basically I think they'll even like try to keep walking right through you rather than going around you. They're not used to seeing anything. There's no polar bears. There's nothing on land that really threatens them in Antarctica. So they're worried about orcas or leopard seals eating them in the ocean. On the land, if anything's going to bother them, it's going to be like a skua coming down and attacking the nest. But there's not like a bear or a dog or anything that naturally occurs there. So they don't really worry about it. So I think as long as you don't go poking them or throwing anything at them. The much bigger threat to those polar penguins is coming from climate change, because a lot of them need to live on the ice. Emperor penguins, they make their nests on the ice, not on the land. And so if that ice melts too early in the year, the nests might not be successful. And so they're absolutely reliant on that sea ice. If we change the amount of ice or the time it forms and melts, that could be devastating them, because they're not really, they go back to their breeding colonies year after year after year. They won't just, move to a new place if things get disrupted necessarily. So yeah, I'd worry about that first and foremost, but I've never been on a penguin cruise. I assume they don't let you pet them.
Right. I have one last question, since we have time and since the audience questions we seem to have gotten through. Do penguins molt, other than, like you said, when they go through that, I think you talked about that one penguin species where the babies have that 6-week period of, being starved, their parents leave them and they molt. Do penguins routinely molt
They do. So most
with
birds
change of
molt.
season and whatnot?
Yeah, they molt once a year, and they call it catastrophic molt. It's a ornithology term, but it basically means they lose all their feathers almost all at once. So if you're a normal bird, they'll let one wing feather come out at a time, so that they never create a gap in the wing foil. So one will push out and then the next one will come in. Penguins can't really do that because they don't want to create any holes in their kind of wetsuit. So they have to go on land. They basically have all their new feathers push out the old feathers, and they just look horrible. They look like they're shedding. It's actually the worst time of year at the New York Central Park Zoo is when the penguins molt. It puts a lot of stress on the filters because all their feathers are getting sucked in.
Oh
and
no,
so
I'm sure.
yeah, they look pretty mangy. But I think it takes them like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or so, and then they're back to normal. So they try to really bulk up on food before they do that, because again, they can't really feed. And that's a time when they're vulnerable too. That's another reason. Imagine if you had to stand naked in place for 2 weeks, you definitely don't want any predators around.
Absolutely.
It's a good question though.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to our audience and all of their questions. I'm really glad that you showed us those exhibits that are to come in those last few slides. And I just want to give a little, I already put this in the chat, but just to remind everyone, if you have a New Canaan Library card, you can come into the library and borrow museum passes to visit the Bruce Museum. So definitely take advantage of that. And do you have anything else to add, Daniel, or?
That's it. I wanted to say we are still open. We have a really fun light and sound show on that. It's a projection show by the artist Holly Danger. So it's crazily immersive. You're kind of in this, you're seeing waterfalls and kaleidoscopes and everything while music plays. Really fun for kids. And our other gallery is being reinstalled right now, but we're getting ready for June when we will open Amazon. I think that's June 19th. Amazing show, all the diversity of Amazon. It's art and science, so you'll see sloths and jaguars and crazy insects with like heads that look like lanterns, but also art and photography by artists from Brazil and other places in the Amazon region. So I think it's going to be a blockbuster, and I hope you can join us in June to see that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes because it looks like people are commenting in there.
A question, what can be done to save emperor penguins?
Oh, yep.
Sorry, I was looking at the Q&A and not the chat.
Same here.
But, yeah, I think that emperor penguins, no one's hunting them. There's no natural predators that get them. No one's getting oil in that region yet. I hope they don't start drilling for oil in America. The number one thing with emperor penguins is definitely climate change. And so as we talked about, when you nest on ice, if the ice melts, your whole species is in peril. And so there's nothing that we're doing intentionally to harm them. But, I guess when you think about driving your car and flying on an airplane and all of that stuff, those are the activities that contribute to climate change. And I think it looks like our nation's finally taking it seriously now and looking more at electric cars and solar panels and things like that. So, if you have the means and the opportunity, put those panels on your house. I don't want to recommend any particular car. You can buy a Tesla if you want, but like mass transit, anything you do that reduces carbon, that's the best way to help an emperor penguin, more than any other activity. And of course, that goes a long way towards helping ourselves too. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the nice comments. I'm excited we will have penguins in the museum. We actually have 8 of our own penguins now in our collection. We have fossil penguins. We'll have penguin eggs. There even will be, believe it or not, a penguin mummy in the penguin show. And so I'll leave that
Wow.
as a surprise, but there's a lot of fun things we have planned for that show. Even some movies of robot penguins. So I think it will be a lot of fun for people of all ages. And that will be, again, when the whole new wing opens in the end of next year. But the Cycles is coming up sooner, and Amazon is right around the corner.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.
Okay, take care, everyone. Good night.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.